Sustainability is a word that's very common in our culture. From a principled perspective, sustainability works, first of all, from the definition given a number of years ago from the United Nations Brundtland Report, that is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. So words like reduce, reuse, recycle, concern for the environmental sustainability, pollution, greenhouse gases, global warming, these are obviously the central problems of our age. But they're often technical problems that have to be resolved from a technical point of view from the position of many, many public people. From a principled point of view, problems are not just environmental. They're not just dealing with material problems, not just material things. There are social issues involved, like poverty and homelessness and affordable housing. There are cultural issues that involve a lack of community, a sense of enemy, individuals not feeling connected to other individuals, not just being alone, but literally feeling isolated from other human beings. There are economic issues. What do we manufacture and how do we manufacture it? Is green design, for example, the foundation of our manufacturing from the very get-go? Because reuse, recycle involves somehow also a mechanical process. It's not an automatic process. It involves energy and so forth. So it's important to design and manufacture things from the very beginning so they either go back into the material cycle or they go back in somehow an environmental cycle. The principal view of sustainability then involves an integrated systemic approach to problems, not merely a technical approach. How do we create a quality of life that integrates the physical, the social, and the spiritual needs of people? As we've pointed out in other lectures, we are children who are created in the image of God. All human beings are part of a human family, and we have to understand the first principles that guide us so that we can create a happy, healthy, loving, just human community. Part of the problem in terms of environmental sustainability and what impacts other areas is that there's a current ethic as opposed to a principled ethic in terms of our behavior, how we operate in political, economic, social terms, and so forth. The emphasis in the current ethic is largely individualism. How can I prosper? The individual entrepreneur is held up in the highest ideal in our culture. If somebody has made it, they become the face of magazine covers and books and so forth. So that becomes our ideal. That becomes the person, the entrepreneur who's created enormous wealth becomes the model for our culture. And often our ethic is present-oriented. How can I benefit now? Corporate quarterly reports, for example. Corporations are often focused on how can we create benefit for our shareholders with the next quarter. As you've probably read in the last few days, Tesla Motors had one of the Tesla cars blew up, got on fire because the bottom plate was hit by a piece of metal and the car got on fire. Immediately the stock went down significantly. And this has happened in other areas as well. If a particular company in one quarter does not do well, then often the stock is sold and the price goes down. So it's present-oriented thinking. It's an ethic that emphasizes the present. And it's often based on greed. How can I create as much possible wealth in the shortest possible time? And finally, it's also a consumption-based ethic. Much of what we are looking at, even with the various iterations of iPhones and iPads and so forth, it's almost like daily. There are new iterations of the latest iPad made by this company, and this company is competing with the other company. Competition is good, but if it promotes only consumption-based ideas, it has a lot of problems. Teaching young children, for example, becomes much more difficult. I teach middle school English and history, and I find that children cannot read as closely and carefully as they did in former years. Somehow their focus is not as strong as it was in previous years. They look for things to move quickly. They want to look at the superficial aspect of things rather than carefully and closely and slowly reading carefully. So, in contrast to this current ethic, there's a principled ethic. And here we're talking about interdependence of community and environment, not individualism, but again, from a first principle point of view, from the point of view that we're all connected as children of God to one living community and one living planet, we have to recognize our interdependence as a community. Not only a community and environmentally is connected, but we're connected morally and spiritually. As I mentioned earlier, we all breathe together, and we either breathe well together or we breathe poisonous together. In Shanghai, the article that came out recently is that the food in China is being poisoned by the pollution because economically they want to quickly remove people from poverty, which is a good thing, and they've done many good things. But the consequence, the failure to work with other people in their culture to define progress as something that impacts the entire community, not just now the upcoming parvenus, the middle class. Also, the principled ethic is future-oriented, not just current-oriented. The emphasis instead of greed is compassion, altruism, and it's value-based rather than consumption-based. Again, purpose, principles, and value are all part of the principled mix, rather than just the individual seeking well-being at the expense of often the environment and the larger community. Now, in any society, there are several sectors. There's the private sector that creates wealth. There's the public sector, which involves government that ideally sets forth the rules of the game, so to speak, laws of justice that help businesses and the private sector function so that there is a sense of fairness. That in reading this book, The Bully Pulpit, about Teddy Roosevelt, the great concern in 1900 is that large corporations were controlling, 3 or 4 corporations were controlling 80% of all the coal in the country, that 3 or 4 people were controlling all the railroads in the country, knocking out often small manufacturers and small companies that were trying to ship oil and other things so that there could be a monopoly price, the desire that a large amount of money could be created if a small group of people established a trust, essentially a monopoly, so that small producers could not benefit as they could benefit. So again, principles have to be involved. And in the independent sector, where we gain our morality, our sense of compassion, our sense of fairness and justice, is not necessarily from the government. It's often not from economic activity creating wealth, although every business in some way serves people. The question again is fairness. What's the quality of life within a business? How does it impact the environment? How does it impact other human beings? The independent sector involves religious groups, educational groups, social groups of various types. Here's where we learn to live well together as human beings. Religion is about helping people becoming compassionate. Schools, ideally, are helping build people of character who are committed to establishing an ethical society. So the independent sector is very necessary in any democracy, in any healthy country. When that independent sector is gone, again, you just have the government and you have the individual, and there's nothing in between that protects the individual and protects the family. Often even families are broken apart where young people are told if your parents are doing something in North Korea, if the parents are doing something against the government, you must tell that to the block leader. Parents must be punished. So again, even the family loyalty is broken down. Ideas of commitment and loyalty, of friendship, family, these are broken down so that the only relationship is the individual to the government. And unfortunately, in Western culture, in our culture, we've been accused of consumerism being the central god, so that between the individual and the consuming self, there's nothing. Consumption and the promotion of consuming things becomes literally like the state, becomes like a god, of which it becomes more important to consume rather than the quality of life within a culture. Now, there are areas where the principal point of view leads to practical policies. So, for example, since policy follows from purpose, the principled view identifies first principles, again, about the nature of the person who has divine value, that needs to be drawn out in relationship to others and the environment. That we are bound together as a human community, and we are meant to live well in relationship to each other, to build societies of friendship and love. So, in terms of practical policies, it's necessary to see the difference between cities that are based on sprawl and cities that involve waste and isolation, and often the impossibility of community in a real sense, versus communities that are compact, that are based on the pedestrian focus rather than on the automobile. Often in American culture now, there's an emphasis on the third place. Since people are at home and they go to work, where do they build community? How do they interact with friends? If the automobile is central, perhaps third place in our culture has become not the religious organization or some social club, but rather Starbucks or Pete's Coffee Shop. Sitting down, even with strangers, you feel, well, they're working on their computer and you're working on your computer. You feel sort of solidarity rather than an emphasis on just promoting any kind of well-being of community. So also, pedestrian-centered cities have street furniture where you can sit down. In Europe, for example, you have plazas and areas where elder people and young people can play together. If you have cities based on sprawl and the suburbs, you often have older people and young people locked away in their rooms. There's no place to walk because the next mall is several miles away, and it's basically focused on the emphasis on the sprawl rather than, and the beautiful home, the McMansions, rather than the quality of life within a particular city. So cities should be meant for play, for conversation, for exercise, for beauty. And we can learn a lot from Europe and other places within our own country where that becomes a reality. Also, in terms of practical applications of principled ideal of sustainability, we also have to be concerned about green design, green business, green building. And the focus, again, is on from the very beginning. Now, many designs for houses and for products from the very beginning consider how can this be something that contributes to the environmental well-being as well as social well-being. Drought, in fact, in front of this building, they now planted drought-resistant plants, native plants that can survive even though we haven't had much rainfall. There's an ideal of in Merritt College, for example, there's a teachable house that it's called a self-reliant house. And everything, it's meant to help young people, not only at Merritt College, but throughout the Bay Area, to see how every aspect of building a house can promote green design and green building and support the environment rather than harm the environment. So you have the native plants, you have rainwater that is then used for flushing in toilets and so forth. Every aspect of that house is focused upon renewability and comfort and beauty based on principles of sustainability of the environment. Also, in terms of social emphasis of sustainability, affordable housing and homelessness, very serious problems in our culture. We can't solve the bigger problems unless we look at the human problems first. There are some very good examples of housing that can help not only people in the lower middle class, but people of all classes, emphasizing co-housing. Co-housing is now, especially in the Bay Area, very prominent in a number of places, Oakland and Berkeley, where individuals can have their own units, let's say their own apartments, and yet there's a central unit where people can get together to have fellowship, cooking together, they can have lectures, and they can share in common many areas that bring them together. Even though they have, obviously, Americans want their own place and want to feel that individually they have something that is their own, but also, and they do own these units, but also the common unit that helps them build some sort of community bonds together. So Habitat for Humanity, a wonderful program which is significant here in the Bay Area as well, where individuals offer sweat equity to help build the house that they can then buy at a very low rate once they've worked on the house itself. And you have other volunteers working on houses, usually for people of lower income. It gives them a basis by which they see how a community comes together to build houses that help people, and that they themselves can contribute to the house that they own by putting in the sweat equity. Also, in terms of sustainability in faith communities, religious communities are doing a great deal to connect with every area of the physical, the social, the spiritual dimension of well-being, what is sustainable. For example, Allen Temple, I think the largest church in Oakland, there's many different things which, if we look at what churches are capable of doing, Allen Temple has a community outreach center, an emergency food program for the needy, a free clothing pantry, a community health fair, case management services for people living with AIDS, the Allen Temple Haight-Ashbury Recovery Center, a clinical program to assist people recovering from substance abuse, 6 alcohol and drug recovery support groups, anger management and domestic violence prevention classes with over 350 enrollees, a senior citizens activity program, a youth sports and recreation program, a tutorial program for youth and children, a federal credit union, a job information center, 3 senior citizens complexes totaling 175 apartment units, Allen Temple Manor with 24 units of housing for AIDS patients, a family life center including 22 classrooms, a gymnasium, a dance studio, a library, a computer literacy center, a children's center, and administrative offices. And then the Dr. J. Alfred Smith Senior Training Academy offering job training, placements of ex-offenders and the urban poor. And if the church at its best is a caring community, sustainable community, then there's no better example than Allen Temple. Now, all religions can work together. It's not a question of competing with other religious organizations. The needs are great. They're not only the environmental needs, they're the social needs, and there's the community needs, and there's the spiritual needs. All these things can work together. And the needs of the community are very, very real. So we have to look from a systemic point of view, which is a principled point of view. We have to look at the interlocking elements of the physical, the social, and the spiritual, and solving problems through an integrated framework of purpose and value. The principal emphasis is on purpose and value, always. We have to ask those questions. As human beings created in the image of God, how can we build structures that draw out that value and that image of other people and of ourselves? So also, human beings then have the basis of not only creating healthy communities, we have the basis of building a sustainable world. The only way we're ultimately going to deal with the environmental problems is if we help establish human communities of compassion and love. Sense of fairness and justice is the ideal. If we can work together with other communities, not just religious communities, Habitat for Humanity is not a religious community, we can work together with the private sector, the public sector, the non-governmental sector to emphasize the ideals of realizing truly a sustainable culture, rather than just focusing on the environment. We can't solve the environmental problems unless we solve the human problems. That's our challenge. Thank you very much.